Hi, welcome to Fern the Lamb, where I mostly talk about my knitting. My name is Marian, and thank you so much for being here. If you've been here before, you may know that I recently moved back to New Zealand, so I've just been traveling around the country. Today I am coming to you from Auckland. It is a sunny but cloudy day, but tomorrow I will be making my way to another town. Before we begin, I'd love to ask you all a question, and that is, what is your favorite color of yarn to work with is? Just let me know in the comments below. I'd love to read it. For me, my favorite colors are usually browns and greens, and I also love rusty colors, the kinds of colors that are naturally occurring during like the autumn months. I love jewel tones as well, and I'm just inspired by colors that also remind me of something in my life. Today though, I mostly have neutrals, but I do have a splash of color in a pair of socks that I'm very excited to show you. So let's get started. My first finished object I don't have with me. It is the Emotional Support Chicken, which is a pattern by Annette Corsino. I knit this exactly the same as my very first Emotional Support Chicken. It did come out a little bit smaller, so that's just very interesting how our gauge, or my gauge, just kind of changes depending on my mood and like what I'm going through in the time of knitting something. I will just post a photo of it right here, as well as the details of the yarn that I used and maybe also my previous chicken. Moving on to my second finished object, which are my cozy cabled socks by Summer Lee from her book The Sock Project. This is a DK weight sock pattern, and so I held a strand of sock yarn with a strand of kid silk mohair that I had in stash. So it makes such a beautiful, luxurious sock. It's amazing. I knit a size large just to accommodate like the tension and what happens to the fabric when you knit lots of cables. I learned that when knitting cabled socks, it's best to have neutral ease and no negative ease, and that also just helps the cables from not stretching so much when you are wearing them, because they're so much more beautiful when they're just nice and plump. These are just amazing. I love these. If you haven't knit a pair of socks with a strand of mohair, I highly recommend it, especially if you have like a random ball of mohair in your stash. That's exactly what I had. I actually have like one more ball of mohair left. I bought too much when I was planning to knit this sweater, and so yeah. So not only do I like love this sock yarn combination, but I have also changed my mind about how I like to knit my cables. And so I did learn kind of what happens when you knit cables with a cable needle versus without one when I was knitting this sock. In my previous cable projects that I've done, I have knit all of those without a cable needle, which is a nice skill to have. It makes the process a little bit more streamlined and undisturbed. However, I did use a toothpick as a cable needle in this project because the gauge is just a little bit tighter. It's not as easy to work with. So for my first sock, I knit the leg portion with a toothpick, and then by the time that I got to the foot, I got pretty confident, so I didn't use a toothpick anymore. And then when it came to the second sock, I knit the very first cable with a toothpick, and then I was like, you know what, I don't really need that anymore. So I knit the rest of the sock without a cable needle. And something that I learned, the cables done without a cable needle are taller and looser, as opposed to those on the cable needle, which are squishier, plumper, but also kind of shorter as well. So I do see that difference in my socks, and I have also done my research online of like if people are experiencing the same thing, and it very much is a thing. It's kind of like color work, perhaps, when you have like color dominance. It's so interesting how these like little minute ways of knitting can affect the final fabric. So yeah, that's just something that I thought that I would share. I now plan to knit all of my future cabled projects with a cable needle. And then just the last thing with that pattern is that there is a mistake, as I mentioned in my previous episode. And so if you are planning to knit it in the future and you have the book with you, just keep in mind that you are supposed to be knitting the slip stitches in the even rows as opposed to slipping them. As of right now, there is not an errata published for this book. This is about the third mistake that I have come across, but I'm not sure if there are other mistakes, so just thought I'd mention. It doesn't prevent me from knitting any more patterns from the book, however, because I have knit another pair of socks from the same book, and it is the Harriet Socks. I modified it to be a DK weight gauge, so I held 2 strands of Knit Pick Stroll together, and because of that gauge, I followed the kid size instead, which is a 46 cast on that eventually becomes a 48. And that was actually a little bit of a small gripe that I have with this pattern. So in the cuff area, you cast on 46 stitches for the 2x2 cuff with the integrated cable. And then after you're done doing that, you increase 1 stitch in the front in the stockinette portion, and then another stitch in the back in that same area as well. And what kind of happens with that is, let's say this is your sock on one side. When you increase 1 stitch this way and then you increase the other stitch over here, it kind of staggers the pattern. And so that's kind of what happened to this particular design. It's just that attention to detail that would have been nice, but it's also possible that I did something wrong. And what I mean by that is, on this side of the sock, you have a line of purls over here before you start knitting the foot or the sole of the foot. And then on this side, the cables just blend into the stockinette portion of the foot, so there is no line of purls. And the way that I mitigate that is, when I knit my second sock, instead of knitting a knit stitch as the very first stitch, I knit a purl stitch instead. And that will allow that panel to just shift a full stitch. So when you wear the socks, no matter how you put them on, they will always be a mirror reflection of each other. For example, I don't know if this is working. So, okay, in this side, it's the blended stockinette portion of the sock. Then on this side, you have the line of purls. Hope that makes sense. And then maybe it's easier for me to just hold it this way. So let's say you put on your socks like this way, then you have the line of purls on each side, and then if you swap it out, you have the blended cable side. It's just a little thing, no big deal, but just something to keep in mind if you happen to be a little bit of a perfectionist. And then last thing, I just want to say that I love these socks no matter what. I love having thick socks around, especially during the winter time. And I also just really love these because they remind me of my cat Lily, who is no longer with me. She had the most beautiful blue eyes that looked just like this, of course, without the tweed. And so it's just nice to have stuff like this in my wardrobe that remind me of people and little furry animals that I had that I loved so much. That is all for my finished objects. I am now moving on to my works in progress. So my one and only whip right now is my Hylde Sweater. This is a pattern by Anne-Sophie Norby Velling, also known as Augustins DK. And Hylde, I think is how you say it, translates to shelf, and I can definitely see how that is. I really love this pattern. I am modifying this quite a bit, and so one, as you can probably see, I did a crochet method of a provisional cast on because I would ideally love a turtleneck, but that wasn't something that I wanted to tackle right at the beginning of the sweater, and so I'd love to just go back and take care of that if I have enough yarn left over. The other thing that I modified was the gauge, and so this is actually a bulky weight project. I believe the original pattern uses a worsted or an Aran weight held with a lace weight mohair, whereas I'm just using a worsted weight yarn. And the yarn that I am using is Zealana Heron, which is a dream yarn. I'm just so happy that I get to work with this yarn. It was 30% off at the yarn store that I purchased this from. I thought that they were just having like a winter sale, but unfortunately the store is closing down. And so while that's pretty sad to hear, sales kind of come out of that. I would have loved to buy way more yarn, but I'm staying pretty smart with my stash, and of course the whole financial blah 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 that comes with knitting. So when I was actually at the store, I initially wanted to cast on for the Northern Augustins number 7, and that pattern is a DK weight, and I thought that I could get away with this yarn because it is like a thick and thin type of twist. It looks like a DK weight in the skein, but it does bloom a lot because it is a woolen spun. I did ask the ladies at the store if it was like okay as a DK weight, and they did say that it was very much a worsted 10 ply, but I didn't really listen. I still bought the quantities that I needed for the Northern Augustins number 7, and after I swatched it, I learned that I was very much wrong. It definitely is a worsted weight, and my gauge was just like terrible. It was all over the place, and it just wasn't the yarn that I needed to use for that project. The yarn that I actually wanted to use for that project wasn't in store anymore. I believe it was just like out of stock because they are closing down, and so a lot of the sweater quantities that they had available were more of the luxurious, more expensive kind of yarns as opposed to the more budget choices. I had to pivot and figure out what I wanted to do with this yarn. Of course, I needed to do color work in a worsted weight, and the best kind of pattern was the Lumme Pullover by Sari Nordlund. However, I didn't really want to knit that pattern. It didn't really speak to me. I decided to just knit this one because it does remind me a lot of the number 7. So despite there being a gauge difference between the Lumme Pullover and the Hylde, the stitch counts are actually very similar. I knew that I needed to knit the size medium in the Lumme because the way that Sari has you pick the size is by the final bust measurement as opposed to your own bust measurement with like a built-in ease. and that would have been the size medium for me for a 100 cm bust. And the medium size of the Hylde has a very similar stitch count to that of the Lumme, and so I knew that by knitting the size medium in this one, I was also going to sort of get a size medium in the Lumme. I hope that makes sense. So I'm just really trusting my gut with that one. I didn't do a second gauge swatch. I just kind of based what I had in my very first gauge swatch. And what I'm also doing is that I am knitting this using the recommended needles from the Lumme. So that is a 4mm for the ribbing, a 4.5 for the plain stockinette with no color work, and then a 5mm on the color work portion. I am 1 row away from being done with the yoke pattern, and then I am just gonna be cruising with the stockinette, but I am a little bit concerned what the 4.5 gauge is going to look like. And so I am planning to just thread a lifeline right below the yoke. That way, if it ends up being too tight, I can just go back to the 5mm. I think that would be a really good option. I'm still debating whether I should do a mid-project block, but I might just do a nice steam with an iron, which is what I usually do. The other thing that I'm also using the Lumme pattern for guidance is the short row shaping. And so in this Hylde sweater, there is no short row shaping instructions. You kind of just knit the collar, you knit the yoke, the sleeves, the body, and then you're done. Whereas in the Lumme, there are 2 short rows integrated into the sweater. And so one is done below the yoke on the body, and then there's another one on the hem that you could also do. I'm still not sure what I want to do, but it'll be very interesting getting that done. I think short rows, it's like the part of the pattern that I get kind of like anxious about, but I actually like doing them. I did so much short rows for this sweater, so we'll see how it turns out with this one. My only gripe with this pattern is that the designer doesn't state the increase rate from the collar to the yoke. So it's kind of tricky. I did try to figure that out on my own. However, it didn't really make sense because the math didn't quite math. Basically, what I had to do was that I asked ChatGPT to help me out. And yeah, without spilling too much, it's kind of similar to a raglan style increase. And so what I mean by that is that you increase by this much at a time, and then you increase this much, and then back to this amount, and then you kind of go back and forth until you reach the beginning of the round. But the yoke pattern itself is an even increase, and so it starts off as kind of an oval, but then it becomes a circle in the end. So that is all for my whips. I thought that I would share just some plans and a few acquisitions because those acquisitions are my plans. My first plan is knitting a sweater for my husband. So I went into Lupine yesterday, which is a yarn store here in Auckland, and I grabbed 4 of these ginormous hanks of yarn. This is Countrywide Natural 8-ply, 200 grams with 400 meters. It's like pretty awesome. So I am planning to knit my husband the I'm planning to knit this sweater by Petite Knit for my husband My husband, he's a very stretched out human being. He's like a slender 6'4" man. And so I thought that a basic sweater would be a nice start to kind of get to know his body a little bit. I feel like knitting for men is just a bit different, especially compared to knitting for myself, because I like to knit oversized, but I can also do well with a more fitted garment, and there's more like wiggle room for my body type. But for my husband, it's very obvious when something is too tight and when something's too big. He is someone that just like needs a personal tailor in his life. I wanted to knit him a Gansey. It's just one of the requests that he's had for a very long time, but I figured let's just start easy right now. And this is just a very economical way to knit something for him. I think he's very excited, and I am too. I was kind of like a little nervous knitting for him, but to be fair, the sweater that I'm wearing right now is actually kind of his size, and so I think it's fine. I think it's actually going to take as much time as knitting a sweater for myself, because I love an oversized sweater. I'm still debating whether I want this sweater to be like oversized. I have 7 balls of yarn left, and I would say about halfway done with this, maybe. So it's going to be very interesting to see if I have any left over or not. I'm debating how I would like the fit of this sweater to be. So I've decided that I will try it on right now. As I'm doing my try it on tubing, I thought that I would just talk about a yarn store that I recently went to. So I've been to a lot of yarn stores here in New Zealand, and my favorite one so far has to be Eyebright in Nelson. So it's called Eyebright Wool Shop. They used to be a gift shop, and they do convert to like a very beautiful Christmas store, but right now they just transitioned to a wool store back in April, and they had just like a beautiful selection of mostly New Zealand yarn. And so there were a bunch of bases that I would love to try in the future, mostly these like merino mohair blends that replace the need for a strand of mohair in your projects. And so one of those is, well, 2 of those is by Crutchy. One I think is called Nimbus, and then the other is called Sloppy Joe. So I would love to try those in like a cardigan. And then there's also this brand, Touch Yarns. They make this like bulky weight brushed mohair that is very similar to Borsta Alpaca by Sandisgarn, as well as Drops Melody. And I would just like love to try that in the future. The ladies in that store were also just so friendly and so nice. Yeah, it was just like, it was such a spacious store. I didn't feel like so overwhelmed being there. I was able to just take my time because I felt like there was space to think. Like, you know when like you're in like a small store, sometimes it's hard to think. I don't know if that's just me, but because yeah, they have that amount of space, it was just so nice to be there. And not only is it a yarn store, but they also have a guinea pig village that you could visit. And so we fed these guinea pigs. Oh, they're so adorable. If you're in the Nelson area and you perhaps haven't heard about this yarn store that just recently opened, or you're planning to visit the South Island, definitely make a trip. Okay, so this is what it looks like. I have a hard time still predicting what this fit is going to be because it's almost like a raglan where, you know, I'm splitting for sleeves. I haven't really made any armholes. I do still have to knit 2 more centimeters of just a plain stockinette stitch in the main color. And then I split 4 sleeves. When it comes to the sleeves, I am actually casting on twice the amount of stitches than what the Lumme suggest, because Augustins DK is kind of like, she's kind of known for her like oversized silhouettes, which I love. But yeah, I will see how it turns out. I will be doing lots of lifelining at this point. So I'm going to do a lifeline right after the color work. I'm going to do the German short rows. And if the German short rows turns out absolutely terrible, then at least I can just frog back to that lifeline. That way I can really determine the final fit of this garment. Because I over purchased yarn for this sweater that was supposed to be the number 7, I have 3 fully clean balls of fully untouched yarn in this raisin color. I would love to knit the Carlo hat by Paula Strict, but I think it would just be also a good idea to just like use all of this yarn in one project instead of make little projects and have like leftover that I have to also think about. So one of my thoughts is the Sophie hood by Petite Knit. I really love the Sophie scarf. I know it's like a controversial pattern, but I love my Sophie scarf. I wear it a lot. Let me grab it because I have it right there. So this is the Sophie scarf that I have in my wardrobe. I love it. I wear it a lot. And I would love to have a hood version in a not so marled color. And I think if I were like to wear this sweater, it would be really cute to have the hood in this raisin color. So that would make getting dressed up easier. Okay. I'm very excited to see this finish up. Very excited to start working on a hat, hood, scarf situation, as well as a sweater for my husband. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for being here. Let me know in the comments what your favorite color of yarn to work with is. I'd love to hear from you. Also, let me know what project you're working on. And yeah, I'll see you in my next podcast episode. Happy knitting.